The red sun beat down mercilessly on Marcus Stone's back as he brushed away centuries of sand from the ancient stone doorway. 3 days of digging had finally revealed the entrance he knew had to be there. His scanner had picked up strange energy readings from this spot, but even he hadn't expected to find something this big buried under the desert. The carved symbols on the door seemed to shift in the harsh sunlight. Marcus wiped the sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of red sand across his tanned skin. He had explored dozens of alien ruins across the galaxy, but something about this place felt different. The energy readings were unlike anything in his database. His robotic assistant, Tom, rolled up beside him on its treads. "Temperature is rising, sir. We should return to the shelter until evening." Marcus shook his head. "Not now. We're too close." He pulled out his tools and began working on the door's ancient locking mechanism. The desert wind picked up, throwing sand against his protective gear. Other archaeologists might have waited, but Marcus had built his career on taking calculated risks. The lock finally clicked. The sound echoed across the empty desert like a gunshot. Marcus held his breath as he pushed against the heavy stone. It moved slowly at first, then swung open with surprising ease. Cool air rushed out of the darkness, carrying the smell of metal and something else he couldn't quite place. "Tom, lights," Marcus commanded. The robot's powerful beams cut through the darkness, revealing a long corridor that sloped down into the planet's surface. The walls were covered in more of those shifting symbols, but these ones seemed to glow faintly with their own light. Marcus checked his oxygen levels and adjusted his gear. "Record everything," he told Tom as they made their way down. Their footsteps and the whir of Tom's treads echoed off the walls. The corridor seemed to go on forever, spiraling deeper underground. After what felt like hours, they emerged into a vast chamber. Marcus's jaw dropped. The room was perfectly circular, its walls covered in gleaming metal that hadn't tarnished despite the centuries. But what caught his attention was the object floating in the center of the room. A sword hung suspended in midair, spinning slowly. Blue light pulsed along its blade like heartbeats. The weapon looked both ancient and impossibly advanced. Its handle was wrapped in what looked like leather, but shimmered like starlight. "Tom, are you getting this?" Marcus whispered. The robot beeped in confirmation, all its sensors focused on the floating weapon. Marcus walked slowly around the sword, studying it from every angle. The symbols on the walls seemed to be telling a story, but they moved too quickly for him to read. His translator couldn't make sense of them. "Sir," Tom's mechanical voice carried a note of warning. "The energy readings are off the scale. Protocol suggests immediate retreat." But Marcus barely heard the robot. The sword was calling to him. Not with words, exactly, but with something deeper. He reached out toward it, his hand trembling slightly. "Sir, my safety protocols require me to." Tom's voice cut off as Marcus's fingers wrapped around the sword's handle. The weapon felt warm, alive. The blue light raced up Marcus's arm like lightning, but there was no pain. Instead, he felt a rush of knowledge, of power. The symbols on the wall suddenly made perfect sense, though he wished they didn't. This was the Blade of Nightmares, the sacred weapon of an alien queen, and he had just broken about a dozen ancient laws by touching it. The ground began to shake. Sand poured down from cracks appearing in the ceiling. Marcus didn't hesitate. He ran for the corridor, the sword clutched tightly in his hand, Tom rolling rapidly beside him. Behind them, the chamber began to collapse. They burst out into the desert just as the entrance caved in. Marcus stood there panting, staring at the weapon in his hands. The blue light had faded to a gentle pulse that matched his heartbeat. "Tom," he said quietly, "I think we just made a huge mistake." The robot's only response was to point one of its sensors at the sky. Far above them, past the atmosphere, something large and crystal-like had just appeared out of hyperspace. The sword pulsed faster in Marcus's grip. The real trouble was just beginning. Marcus ran through the desert storm, clutching the sword against his chest. The wind howled around him, throwing stinging sand at his face. Behind him, Tom's tread struggled in the loose sand. The robot was falling behind. "Leave me, sir. Return to the ship." Tom's voice crackled through the storm. Marcus stopped and turned back. He wouldn't abandon his faithful robot companion. Fighting against the wind, he grabbed Tom's metal frame and pulled. Together, they pushed through the worsening storm toward their small research ship. The crystal ship in the sky grew larger. Its surface sparkled even through the dust clouds, like a massive diamond catching sunlight. Marcus had never seen anything like it in his years of space exploration. They finally reached their ship, a basic explorer model called the Wanderer. Marcus slammed the airlock shut behind them, and Tom immediately rolled to the control panel. "Unknown vessel approaching," Tom announced. "Their technology isn't in my database." Marcus placed the sword on his research table, but his hand didn't want to let go. The weapon's blue glow had spread up his arm, creating strange patterns under his skin. He should have been terrified, but somehow it felt right. "We need to leave," he said, forcing himself to focus. "Get us into orbit, Tom." The robot began the launch sequence, but Marcus barely noticed. The sword was whispering to him. Not in words, exactly, but in images and feelings. He saw a magnificent crystal palace floating in space. He saw a queen with skin like moonlight and eyes that burned like stars. He saw her placing a curse on the sword, her rage turning its magic dark and deadly. The ship shuddered as it lifted off. Marcus strapped himself in, keeping the sword close. The whispers grew stronger. He began to understand languages he had never learned, ancient tongues that had died out millennia ago. The symbols from the temple walls flashed through his mind, and now he could read them perfectly. "Sir," Tom's voice broke through his thoughts. "You're glowing." Marcus looked down. The blue patterns had spread across his chest now, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. But there was no pain, no fear. The curse that should have killed him was instead changing him. The crystal ship grew larger in their view screen. It was beautiful and terrifying, like a massive jewel that could shoot them down at any moment. Smaller crystal ships emerged from its sides, their formations perfect and deadly. "They're hailing us," Tom reported. Before Marcus could respond, the sword's whispers became a song. The curse flooded his mind with knowledge. He saw the queen's memories, felt her power, understood her loss. The sword had been more than a weapon. It was the heart of her empire, the source of her magic. The smaller ships surrounded them now. Marcus stood up, the sword humming in his grip. Words formed on his lips in a language he had never spoken before, but now understood perfectly. "Tom," he said, his voice somehow different, deeper, "don't respond to their hail. Plot a course for the outer rim." "Sir, we're completely surrounded. Escape is impossible." Marcus smiled. The sword's power coursed through him, making the impossible seem easy. "Nothing's impossible anymore, old friend. The sword is showing me paths between the stars that no one has used for thousands of years." The crystal ships opened fire, but Marcus was ready. He raised the sword, and reality itself seemed to bend around their small ship. The curse that should have destroyed him had instead awakened something ancient in his blood, something that had been sleeping in human DNA since the beginning of time. As the Wanderer slipped between the crystal ship's formation and vanished into space in a way that defied normal physics, Marcus finally understood. The Queen's curse hadn't failed. It had found exactly what it was looking for. The only question was, what would she do when she realized that humans weren't the simple creatures everyone thought they were? The sword pulsed in his hand, and the stars beckoned. Queen Aurora stood in her crystal throne room, her pale fingers gripping the arms of her seat so tightly they left marks in the ancient material. The massive viewing screen before her showed only empty space where the human ship had been moments ago. "Impossible," she whispered, her voice sharp as broken glass. "No one can just vanish like that. Not without our technology." The throne room's crystal walls reflected her rage, turning from their usual calm blue to an angry red. Her guard stood perfectly still, afraid to move. They had never seen their queen this angry in their centuries of service. "Your Majesty," her general, Richard, stepped forward and bowed. The human ship didn't use any known form of faster-than-light travel. It's as if he found a hole in space itself. The queen rose from her throne, her silver dress flowing like liquid starlight. The crown of crystal shards floating above her head spun faster, matching her growing anger. For centuries, she had waited for her sword to be found. The curse she placed on it should have killed anyone who dared touch it. Instead, this human had not only survived, but had used its power in ways even she hadn't thought possible. "Show me the scan results," she commanded. A crystal screen appeared in the air. Data scrolled past, showing readings from the human's body during their brief encounter. The queen's eyes widened as she read. "This can't be right," she said. "These patterns in his DNA, they're like ours, like the ancient ones." Richard moved closer to look at the screen. Humans are supposed to be a young species, barely out of their stone age. How could they have the markers of the world builders? The queen waved her hand, and more screens appeared around them. They showed images of Earth, of humans building their cities, reaching for the stars. She had always ignored them, seeing them as nothing more than another primitive race. But now, "Search the ancient archives," she ordered. "Find everything about Earth, about humans, and get me the keeper of histories." As her servants rushed to obey, the queen closed her eyes. She reached out with her power, following the trace of her curse. The sword's magic pulsed back at her, but it felt different now. The rage she had poured into the curse had changed, transformed by contact with the human's strange blood. Through this connection, she caught flashes of what the human, Marcus, was experiencing. She saw him standing at his ship's controls, the sword glowing in his hands. She felt his wonder as he discovered new powers, his excitement as he unlocked secrets that had been lost for millennia. "My queen," Richard's voice broke through her vision. "The keeper of histories has arrived." The keeper was ancient, his crystal skin almost transparent with age. He carried a single data crystal that glowed with stored knowledge. "Speak," the queen commanded. "The legends are true." The keeper's voice crackled like breaking ice. "Long ago, before the Great Sleep, there was another race of world builders. They vanished during the dark time, and we thought them lost forever. But it seems some of them survived. They forgot their powers, forgot their history, and became what we now know as humans." The queen turned back to the viewing screen, her anger changing to something else. Wonder, perhaps, or fear. "Ready my personal ship," she ordered, "and send word to all our worlds. The sword hasn't been stolen. It has found its way home. And now we must find this human before he unlocks powers that even we have forgotten." As her servants rushed to obey, Queen Aurora smiled. Perhaps this human would prove more interesting than any prey she had hunted in her long life. The galaxy was about to change, and she intended to be there when it happened. The crystal walls of her throne room shifted again, this time to a deep purple of anticipation. The hunt was on. Marcus lay on his bunk, watching the strange blue light pulse beneath his skin. The wanderer drifted silently through what the sword told him was called the space between, a place that existed in the gaps between normal space. Here, the normal rules of physics didn't apply, and the Queen's crystal ships couldn't follow. "Sir," Tom's voice came through the ship's speakers. "The sword's energy readings are still increasing. If this continues, it might overload our sensors." Marcus sat up slowly. The sword floated beside him, spinning gently in the air. Over the past few days, he had learned to let it drift freely when he rested. It always came back to his hand when he needed it. "How long until we need to return to normal space?" he asked. 2 hours, Tom replied. "We cannot maintain this, whatever this is, for much longer. The ship's hull wasn't designed for it." Marcus nodded. The sword was teaching him many things, but even it had limits. They would need to resurface eventually, like a submarine coming up for air. And when they did, the Queen's ships would be waiting. He walked to the bridge, the sword floating along beside him. The view screen showed strange patterns of light and color that hurt his eyes if he looked at them too long. But through his connection to the sword, he understood what he was seeing. This was how the Ancient Ones had traveled, slipping between the cracks in reality. Picking up vibrations, Tom announced. Something big is moving through normal space above us. Marcus closed his eyes and gripped the sword. Through its power, he could sense them too. Crystal ships, dozens of them, searching the trade routes and known space lanes. The Queen was using every resource she had to find him. A new image flashed through his mind. The Queen herself, standing in a room made of crystal, watching screens that showed maps of the galaxy. She was beautiful in an alien way, her skin like moonlight, her eyes filled with stars, and she was looking right at him. Marcus gasped and opened his eyes. The sword had somehow connected them, letting them see each other across the vast distance of space. He had felt her surprise, her anger, but also her curiosity. She wasn't just hunting him to get her sword back anymore. She wanted answers. "Tom, change course," he ordered. "Plot a route through the Outer Rim colonies. We need to stay near populated areas." "Sir, that's extremely dangerous," Tom protested. "The Queen's ships will be watching those regions closely." "Exactly," Marcus smiled. "But they're also full of smugglers, traders, and ships of all kinds. Perfect cover for a small vessel like ours. And we can duck back into the space between if we need to." The sword hummed approvingly. Each time they entered and left the space between, Marcus understood more about its powers. The curse that the Queen had placed on it wasn't just a tracking spell. It was a test, designed to find someone who could use the sword's full potential. A warning light flashed on the console. "Multiple ships entering this sector," Tom reported. "Crystal design confirmed. They're getting better at predicting where we'll surface." Marcus gripped the sword tightly. Its blue light spread up his arm, showing him paths and possibilities that no normal human could see. "Ready for emergency maneuvers, Tom. We're going to show them why humans have survived all these years despite being primitive." The sword pulsed with power as the Wanderer prepared to return to normal space. The Queen might have armies and advanced technology, but Marcus had something better: human ingenuity and a weapon that seemed to like him better than its original owner. The chase was far from over, but for the first time, Marcus felt like he might have a chance to win it. Marcus's dreams were filled with ancient memories that weren't his own. He saw great cities that floated among the stars, ships that could fold space like paper, and weapons that could reshape reality. The sword was showing him the truth about humanity's past, and it was more amazing than anything he had imagined. He woke with a start as the Wanderer shuddered. They were hidden in an asteroid field, using the large rocks as cover from the Queen's patrols. The sword floated near him, its blue glow reflecting off the metal walls. "Tom, status report," he called out. "3 crystal ships passed by 10 minutes ago," the robot replied. "They didn't detect us, but our power reserves are running low. We can't stay hidden much longer." Marcus walked to the ship's small bathroom and looked in the mirror. The blue patterns under his skin now covered most of his body, forming intricate designs that reminded him of circuit boards mixed with ancient runes. But it was his eyes that shocked him most. They now held the same starlight he had seen in the Queen's gaze. The sword suddenly pulsed brightly, and Marcus felt the Queen's presence in his mind again. This time, instead of trying to break the connection, he held it. "You're beginning to understand, aren't you?" Her voice echoed in his thoughts. She wasn't angry anymore. She sounded almost excited. "The sword is showing me things," Marcus replied mentally, "about what humans used to be, about what we forgot." Through their connection, he felt her smile. "Your people were called the World Shapers," she said. "You could bend reality itself. But something happened, something terrible. You chose to forget your powers, to become simple beings who would have to climb back to the stars slowly. Images flashed through Marcus's mind. A great war, planets shattering, space itself tearing apart. The world shapers had grown too powerful, too dangerous. They chose to lock away their powers, to start over as simple humans who would have to earn their way back to greatness. The curse on the sword, Marcus realized. It wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to wake up our old powers. Yes, the Queen's mental voice was gentle now. We are the Crystal Empire because we found some of your people's old tools. Learn to use a fraction of your powers. We've been waiting for the true heirs to return. Tom's voice broke through their mental conversation. Sir, energy spike detected. Multiple ships dropping out of hyperspace. Marcus ran to the bridge, the sword flying to his hand. The view screen showed 5 crystal ships surrounding them, but they weren't charging weapons. Instead, they were projecting a peaceful signal. Your ship is damaged. The Queen's voice came through both the regular communications and their mental link. Let us help you. There is so much you need to know, so much your people need to remember. Marcus looked at the sword in his hand. The blue patterns on his skin matched the designs on the crystal ships perfectly. Humanity's forgotten past was reaching out to them, offering to help them remember who they really were. Tom, he said quietly, power down weapons. Open a channel to the lid ship. The robot turned its sensors toward him. Sir, are you sure? According to all our protocols. Our protocols were written by humans who had forgotten who they were. Marcus smiled. It's time to remember. The sword hummed with approval as Marcus stepped forward to address the Queen's ships. The truth about humanity's past would change everything. Every history book, every assumption about their place in the galaxy. But as the blue light of ancient power flowed through him, Marcus knew it was time. Humanity hadn't just reached the stars. They had built them. The Queen's throne room was more beautiful than Marcus had imagined. Crystal walls rose hundreds of feet into the air, each surface reflecting starlight in endless patterns. The sword hummed in his hand, recognizing its old home. Tom rolled beside him, his metal frame looking out of place among the crystal guards. The robot had refused to stay behind on the Wanderer, saying his programming wouldn't allow him to leave Marcus alone in a potentially hostile situation. Welcome, World Shaper, Queen Aurora's voice echoed through the vast chamber. She stood from her crystal throne, her silver dress flowing like liquid moonlight. The floating crown above her head sparkled with stored power. Marcus walked forward, matching her formal tone. Thank you for the invitation, Your Majesty. The blue patterns under his skin glowed brighter as he got closer to her. The sword's power recognized something in her too. You look different from when I first sensed you, she said, walking down the throne's crystal steps. The sword has changed you more than I expected. It's been teaching me, Marcus replied. He held up his free hand, letting starlight dance between his fingers just as he had seen in his dreams, showing me what humanity used to be, what we could be again. The Queen circled him slowly, studying the patterns on his skin. Her guards tensed, but she waved them back. When I placed the curse on the sword, I hoped it would find someone who could truly use it. But I never expected it would find one of the original world shapers. We're not the same people we were, Marcus said. Humans chose to forget their powers for a reason. The sword showed me the war, the destruction. And yet here you stand. The Queen stopped in front of him, wielding powers that my people have spent millennia trying to understand. One human man doing what entire teams of our scientists couldn't achieve. Marcus felt her power reach out, testing his defenses. The sword responded automatically, creating a shield of blue light around him. Tom's sensors whirred in alarm. Sir, the robot warned, energy levels are reaching dangerous heights. But Marcus stayed calm. He could feel the Queen's true intentions through their mental link. This wasn't an attack, it was a test. Your people built this sword, she said, her power pressing against his shield. Show me you deserve to wield it. Marcus took a deep breath and did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He lowered his shield, and held out the sword, offering it to her. "I don't want to prove I'm stronger," he said quietly. The old world shapers fell because they were too focused on power. Humanity chose a different path. We learned to work together, to build things slowly, to earn our way back to the stars. The Queen's eyes widened. Her power pulled back, and a smile spread across her face. "And that," she said, "is exactly why the sword chose you." She reached out, but instead of taking the sword, she placed her hand over his on the handle. Blue and crystal light merged, filling the throne room with impossible colors. Through their connection, Marcus felt her relief and joy. The Queen had spent centuries looking for someone worthy of the old powers, fearing they would find another conqueror. Instead, she had found something better, a human who understood the responsibility that came with such power. "So," Marcus said, as their combined power illuminated the ancient crystal walls, "what happens now?" The Queen's smile grew wider. "Now, Marcus Stone, we begin to rebuild what was lost. But this time, we do it together." Around them, the Crystal Palace hummed with new energy, as if it too was ready for what would come next. Humanity's past and future were about to merge, and the galaxy would never be the same. 1 year had passed since Marcus first touched the sword in that desert temple. He stood at the window of the Crystal Palace's new human wing, watching ships come and go from the busy spaceport below. Some were the elegant crystal ships of the Queen's fleet, but many were human vessels, coming to learn about their forgotten heritage. The sword floated beside him, its blue glow now a familiar comfort. The patterns under his skin had stabilized, forming permanent marks that told the story of humanity's ancient past. Tom stood nearby, his metal frame now decorated with crystal accents, a gift from the Queen's engineers. "The first group of human students is ready for their lesson," Tom announced. "They're waiting in the Grand Hall." Marcus smiled. Teaching other humans about their forgotten powers was his favorite part of his new role as ambassador between Earth and the Crystal Empire. The Queen had been right. Humanity needed to remember slowly, carefully, learning from the mistakes of the past. "How many this time?" he asked, walking toward the hall with the sword floating behind him. 20, Tom replied. "All carefully chosen. Scientists, artists, builders, people who understand the importance of using power wisely." The Grand Hall's doors opened automatically as Marcus approached. Inside, 20 humans of different ages and backgrounds waited. Their eyes widened at the sight of his glowing skin and the floating sword, but none showed fear. They had been chosen well. "Welcome," Marcus said, his voice carrying easily in the crystal chamber. "You're here because humanity is ready to remember who we once were. But more importantly, you're here to help decide who we will become." The sword pulsed, and Marcus felt the Queen's presence before she entered. She had gotten better at moving quietly over the past year, but the sword always knew when she was near. The students bowed as she entered, her crystal crown catching the light. "Your people are learning quickly," she said to Marcus, both out loud and through their mental link. "Faster than anyone expected." Marcus nodded. In the past year, humans had already begun remembering their old abilities. Small things at first: better understanding of ancient technology, natural skill with crystal tools, occasional glimpses of the space between. But it was happening the right way this time, with wisdom and care rather than rushing for power. "Show them," the Queen said softly. Marcus raised the sword, and the chamber's crystal walls came alive with images. The students gasped as they saw their ancestors' achievements: the floating cities, the reality-shaping ships, the wonders that humanity had chosen to forget. "But we'll show you something else too," Marcus said. The sword changed the images, showing the destruction of the ancient war, the price of too much power gained too quickly. "This is why we chose to forget, and this is why we must remember slowly, wisely." The Queen stepped forward, her dress shimmering. "Your ancestors and my people were once enemies," she said to the students. "Now we are teachers, friends, allies. This is the true power of humanity, not the ability to shape reality, but the wisdom to know when and how to use such gifts. Marcus felt a familiar tingle in his hand. The sword was happy, if such an object could feel happiness. It had completed its mission, not just finding someone who could use its power, but helping bridge the gap between two civilizations. "Now," Marcus said, letting the sword's blue light fill the room, "who's ready to begin?" 20 hands raised immediately. Behind them, through the crystal walls, the stars seemed to shine brighter. Humanity was remembering its past, but this time, they weren't walking the path alone. And somewhere in those stars, new wonders waited to be discovered, not by the world shapers of old, but by humans who had learned from both their past and their present. The sword pulsed one final time, its curse transformed into a blessing that would guide humanity's return to greatness.